What if loving someone means knowing when to let them go before they break because of you? In today's episode, we dive into a quiet but painful moment inside the hospital, where Diep begins to push James away, not because she loves him less, but because she loves him too much. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll explore this emotional turning point together. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning arrived without asking for permission. It crept quietly into the hospital room, sliding through the narrow gap between the curtains, touching the walls with a pale, indifferent light. Nothing dramatic changed. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The hallway outside remained distant and muted, yet somehow the air felt different, heavier, more aware of itself. Diep opened her eyes. For several seconds she stayed still, staring at the ceiling above her. She counted the tiny cracks she had memorized over the past few days. The faint discoloration near the corner she always forgot was there until morning reminded her again. Then she turned her head. James was sitting in the chair beside her bed, asleep. His body leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped together. His jacket was still on, wrinkled at the shoulders. His phone rested in his palm, as if he had fallen asleep in the middle of waiting for something that never came. He looked different when he slept, less guarded, less composed. Diep studied his face carefully, as if afraid that if she blinked, the image would disappear. The faint shadow beneath his eyes, the tight line of his jaw even in rest, the way his breathing was shallow, uneven, like someone who hadn't slept deeply in days. A quiet ache pressed against her chest. She shifted slightly under the blanket, careful, slow. The movement was small, almost nothing, but James stirred immediately. His head lifted, eyes opening with instinctive alertness before confusion followed. "You're awake," he said softly. "I didn't mean to wake you," Diep replied. "It's okay." He straightened in the chair, rubbing his hands together once, grounding himself. "How are you feeling?" She considered the question. "Better," she said at last. It was the answer she always gave, not because it was completely true, but because it was the easiest to carry. James nodded, relief passing quickly through his expression before settling into something calmer. He reached for the cup of water on the table, helping her sit up with practiced care. His hand supported her back, firm and steady, as if he had done this 100 times. As she drank, her eyes remained on him. She noticed how his movements were slower this morning, more deliberate, as if every action required an extra moment of thought. When she handed the cup back, their fingers brushed briefly. His skin felt warm, too warm for someone who had spent the night in a chair. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He paused. "Yeah," he said. "A little." She nodded, though something inside her resisted the answer. She had seen him asleep. She knew better. James adjusted the pillow behind her, tugging the blanket higher when he noticed her hands trembling slightly. His touch lingered, gentle but restrained, like he was afraid of crossing a line that only existed in his own mind. They sat in silence. It wasn't awkward. It never was. And it wasn't empty either. The quiet between them was filled with things they were both aware of but unwilling to name. "James," Diep said quietly. He looked up. "What is it?" Her voice hesitated. "Are you tired?" The question landed softly but firmly. James smiled, the same smile he had used for days now. The kind meant to reassure, not to reveal. "I'm fine," he said. She searched his face, hoping, irrationally, that he would say more, that he would admit something, anything. Instead, he stood and turned toward the window, adjusting the curtain as if it required his full attention. "I'll get you breakfast," he said. "The nurse said you can eat a bit more today." "Okay," she replied. He stepped into the hallway moments later, phone already pressed to his ear. Diep lay back against the pillow, staring at the space he'd just left behind. The room felt quieter without him, as if it had lost its centre. At first, she didn't listen, but the hallway carried sound easily, and James's voice, low, controlled, reached her anyway. "I know," he said. "I just can't leave right now." A pause. "Yes, I understand that." Another pause, longer this time. "Give me a little more time." The words settled into her chest, heavy and unwelcome. Diep closed her eyes. She imagined the life waiting outside these walls, the one James belonged to, the one she had unknowingly pulled him away from. Footsteps approached. A soft knock. The doctor entered, clipboard in hand, expression calm and practiced. He checked her vitals, asked routine questions, nodded thoughtfully. "Everything looks stable," he said, "but we'll continue monitoring." Diep swallowed. "So, I'm staying longer?" "For now," he replied gently. "No rush." After he left, the room felt still again. James returned with a tray of food, setting it down carefully. He helped her sit up, his hand steady against her shoulder. "Nothing special," he said, "but it's warm." "Thank you." She ate slowly, aware of his eyes on her the entire time, not watching in concern but in quiet vigilance, as if her presence alone demanded his attention. When she finished, she placed the spoon back on the tray. "James," she said. "Yes." She took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. "Maybe you should go take care of your work for a while." The word surprised even her. James froze. "What?" "I mean..." She forced herself to keep speaking. "I'm okay. You don't have to stay here all the time." "I want to stay," he said immediately. "I know." She turned her head toward the window. "But you don't have to choose me over everything else." The room seemed to shrink around them. James stared at her, something unspoken tightening in his chest. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Outside, the hospital continued its routine. Nurses walked past. Voices echoed faintly. Life moved forward. Inside the room, they remained still. Neither of them knew which words would hurt less. James didn't answer her right away. He remained standing beside the bed, hands resting loosely at his sides, as if he wasn't sure what to do with them anymore. Diep could feel his gaze on her, steady and searching, even though she refused to look back. "You think I'm staying because I don't know what else to do?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No." "Then why are you asking me to leave?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusatory. It was careful, almost fragile. Diep pressed her lips together. She stared at the glass of the window, at the reflection of the room layered faintly over the outside world. "Because I can see it," she said finally. "See what?" "How tired you are." James exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. He moved back to the chair and sat down, but this time he didn't lean forward. He sat upright, shoulders squared as if bracing himself. "I told you," he said. "I'm fine." She turned then, really looked at him. "You say that every time," she said softly, "but your voice doesn't sound the same anymore." For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not frustration. Something closer to being exposed. He looked down at his hands. "You don't need to worry about me," he said. "That's not why you're here." "That's exactly why I'm worried," she replied. Silence settled again. James leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. The hum of the machines filled the space between them. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped rhythmically, steady and indifferent. "I chose this," he said at last. "No one forced me." "I know," Diep said. "But choice doesn't mean it doesn't cost you anything." His jaw tightened slightly. "I can handle it." She didn't argue, she just watched him. James had always been like this, absorbing weight quietly, carrying it without complaint. She had admired that about him, trusted it. Now it scared her. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said. He gave a small, humorless smile. "Someone has to be." The words landed heavier than he intended. Diep looked away again, blinking slowly. "I don't want to be the reason you break," she said. He turned toward her immediately. "You're not." "But what if I am?" Her voice was barely above a whisper now. What if one day you look back and realise you lost something important because you stayed here with me? James stood abruptly. That's not how this works, he said, more firmly now. I don't measure my life in things I lost. But people do, she replied, even when they don't mean to. He took a step closer to the bed, stopping just short of touching it. Listen to me, he said. I'm not here because I feel obligated. I'm here because I want to be. Diep finally met his eyes. And what if one day, she asked quietly, you don't want to anymore? The question hung between them, raw and unguarded. James had no answer. He looked at her, really looked at her, lying there beneath the thin hospital blanket, trying to push him away, not out of anger, but out of fear. Fear of becoming too much. Fear of being left behind. I don't know the future, he said after a long moment. I only know right now. And right now, she said, you look like someone who hasn't slept in days. A faint breath of laughter escaped him, despite himself. Maybe, he admitted. She softened then, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't want you to disappear into this room, she said. I don't want to be the only thing you see. James sat back down slowly. You're not, he said. But you are where I need to be. They stayed like that for a while, neither moving, neither speaking. The morning passed unnoticed. Light shifted across the walls, brighter now, more certain of itself. A nurse came in briefly to check the IV, offered a polite smile, then left again. When the door closed, James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There are a few things I need to take care of, he said. Just calls, nothing urgent. Diep nodded, though her chest tightened. I can step outside, he added. You don't have to, she said, but he already was. He stood near the door, phone pressed to his ear, voice low. Yes, I know. No, I haven't forgotten. I'll get to it. Each pause felt longer than the last. Diep watched him from the bed, the way his shoulders tensed slightly with each response, the way his free hand rubbed the back of his neck unconsciously. This was the part of him she rarely saw, the part pulled in two directions at once. When he hung up, he didn't turn back right away. You can go, she said gently. James looked over his shoulder. Just for a little while, she added. I'll be here. He walked back toward the bed, stopping beside her. He reached out, hesitated, then rested his hand lightly over hers. Promise me you won't push yourself, he said. She nodded. Promise me you won't disappear. He met her gaze, something unreadable passing between them. I'll come back, he said. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but it mattered. James grabbed his jacket and stepped toward the door. Before leaving, he turned once more. Diep was watching him, not with fear, with trust. The door closed softly behind him. The room felt different again, quieter, larger. Diep lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since she'd been admitted, she was truly alone. Her breathing slowed. Somewhere inside her chest, a question formed, one she wasn't ready to answer yet. Outside the hospital, life continued moving forward, and for the first time in days, James wasn't beside her to hold it still.
Trong tập này, Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà. để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.